A very rich man once said, making money is easy. Figuring out how to get it to multiply, that's what's hard. And maybe that's why so many social workers spend so much time figuring out how to find a high paying job as opposed to learning how to keep and multiply the income that they already have. But not Tara Red. She's a social worker who's taken the steps to learn how not only to keep more of the money she earns, but also how to have it grow and compound through investment. And she's just about reached her financial goal of financial independence and early retirement, 20 years ahead of a typical retirement schedule, a journey she documents on her blog at Love Feeds Wealth. Now, in the conversation you're about to view, Tara explains how she started her financial independence, retire early, or FIRE journey, difference between FIRE and financial capability, and how our patterns of thinking about money influence every aspect of our relationships, intimate or otherwise. Now, that's part one. In part two, she answers viewers' questions about how to retire early with a low income or high debt, and she even gives advice to younger social workers just starting out. So make sure you subscribe with your notifications turned on so you don't miss a post. Now, you might not know it, but this marks the third time we're actually sitting down to record this for you. And when I asked Tara why it was so important for her to show up yet again to get this done, she said it was because so many of her friends and colleagues, most of which are social workers, are afraid to have this conversation because money inspires too many negative emotions. She hopes that watching this video inspires us to learn more about how to maximize our financial capability now rather than some identified point in the future. And I do too. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Love Feeds Wealth FIRE blogger, Tara Red. Tara Red, welcome to Rich Social Worker.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I really believe in what you're doing. I love your blog, as I've said before, and I want my viewers to know that this is an important conversation. And you, along with Samina Kwan, who will be in a future video, you guys, the financial journey that you're on is just, I believe it's just so important for more social workers to know about. So I'm happy to have you here, happy that you've agreed to come on 3 times, which leads me to the question, how did you get into this journey? And if you could also talk a little bit about your credentials of how you got to this channel.
Sure. Well, I first found out about financial independence, retire early, or FIRE from a fellow social worker. You named her, Samina Kwan. And Samina and I were actually working for the same program. And she mentioned to me that she and her partner were focused on really just revamping their finances. And she left me these little breadcrumbs to kind of pique my interest. And so when she finally disclosed that her goal was to reach financial independence and retire early, I was a little bit appalled because my first thought was, well, if you're not working, what are you going to do? Right? You're a social worker. I'm a social worker. If we aren't working as social workers anymore, who are we? And I just thought it was the most absurd idea. And then right after that, my partner Squash, who is now my husband, and I left the country for our first trip together. And I had such an amazing time. I was depressed when I came back to my job, right? The first thing that I did when I got to my desk was to Google early retirement. And, just on a whim, because I was upset that I was back at my job, right? I wanted to be on vacation. And I remembered what Samina had mentioned in terms of FIRE. So I called her up and I asked her if we could set aside some time and talk a bit more. And she very generously agreed. So that got me started to learn more about what FIRE was and if it was really something that I could pursue.
I love that you were proactive in that, because I think, I'd like to believe that my viewers are also proactive. Otherwise, they would not be here, especially the people that choose to subscribe. But, listening to information is one thing, or hearing it is one thing, and putting it into practice is another. So, I know that you just started your blog not too long ago. Um, do you mind sharing with us, about the blog, how it came to be? Because you didn't just start the blog when you started this journey. You started the journey a while back, right?
That's right. So Samina and I had our first conversation in early 2015,
Hmm.
probably in April, actually. So exactly 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And you asked me about my credentials, and I don't think I answered that question. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I have been a licensed clinical social worker since 2008, but I've been practicing as a social worker since 2003. And you and I share an alma mater, right? We both
Hmm.
graduated with our master's degrees from Columbia University in the
Hmm.
city of New York.
That's
So
right.
I feel like I've been a social worker long enough
Yeah.
to go through those stages, right? Where in the beginning we're hyper motivated and so idealistic. And,
Yeah.
we say it so many times that it almost becomes a mantra, right? I'm not in it for the money.
Yeah.
I'm not in it for the money. And that is true. And then at one point in life, money becomes more important
Hmm.
than it might have been
Hmm.
before. And I
Hmm.
think for me, I know I took out student loans to pay for
Hmm.
my master's degree without ever having earned as much money as I took out in
Hmm.
debt,
Hmm.
right? And not really knowing what it would feel like to have to write that check every single month alongside rent,
Hmm.
alongside these other things that I wanted to do that I wasn't necessarily thinking about when
Hmm.
I was in my 20s and pursuing a career in social work. So, about the blog, um, I have learned so much by reading blogs by other FIRE adherents, is, is what I call them. So, people that have pursued FIRE,
Hmm.
especially those who have documented their journey from a place of indebtedness, right, to
Hmm.
FIRE. And in my mind, I always thought, okay, well, once I reach my goal, right, once I'm out living my best life, I want to launch my blog too, so that way I can give back.
Hmm.
And I felt that until I reached my goal, I didn't have enough to say, or maybe my life wasn't shiny enough to really publicly write about. And
Hmm.
then the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden we had no commutes and
Hmm.
lots of free time, right, to engage in new hobbies. So I
Hmm.
bit the bullet and I launched Love Feeds Wealth last August.
Yeah, and the world is so much better for it. Talk about how you came up with the name, because I love this story.
So the two things that I probably think the most about and talk the most about with my colleagues and my friends and my family are healthy relationships and financial capability. And for my social work colleagues who are familiar with it, there are the now 13 grand challenges for social work. And
Hmm.
of those 13, one focuses on building healthy relationships,
Hmm.
another focuses on building financial capability.
Hmm.
And I didn't see any other blog in the FIRE space that really explored both of these concepts together.
Hmm.
And I think that's also where we as social workers have an advantage, right? We're all about building healthy relationships, but we're not necessarily about building financial capability for ourselves, right? How many of us
Exactly.
have worked with clients where that is their primary focus, right? But in terms of turning it back onto ourselves, I think there's so much shame often,
Hmm.
there's trauma, there's guilt, that it's really hard to turn that mirror, if you will, back on ourselves to do this
Hmm.
work.
Why do you think focusing on finances is important for social workers to do as well as the relationship?
So I don't think I realized this until I started paying all of my bills,
Hmm.
right? Money is not separate from everything else that we value about life, right?
Hmm.
Money actually operationalizes what our values and priorities are. And I think too long, I sort of sequestered finances and thinking about money as something that was peripheral to all these other things that I wanted to do in my life. And that was just a false separation.
Hmm.
And in terms of love feeds wealth, I believe that our journeys begin within our own families. right? So when we think about wealth, so much of what privilege I have was conveyed to me from my parents, right? So much of what they have was conveyed to them by their parents. And so these patterns of privilege and disadvantage tend to get compounded over time across multiple generations. Excuse me. And I wanted a space to talk about that because I don't think we do that enough. When we think about love, we think about intimate relationships. We don't think about the relationship that I, as an adult, might have with my aging parents, or that I, as an adult, might have with my adult children, or the relationships that I have with my friends, my siblings, my bosses, right? All of those relationships impact my financial capability, which is the ability and opportunity to pursue my happiness. However, my definition of happiness can change over time.
I love that. And, one of the things that I also notice when I'm reading your blog, you spend a lot of time not just talking about FIRE, but talking about mindsets, talking about perspectives. And, there's a part where you have fictitious people write in with their questions and then you answer them. And they're not usually asking about FIRE, they're talking about situations in their lives. So, I'm wondering why is that an important thing that you thought you wanted to highlight, those perspectives and beliefs?
Well, speaking to a community of social workers, I think most of your viewers will understand when I say I'm a big fan of cognitive behavioral theory.
Yeah.
Right? I believe that our actions are influenced or completely shaped really by our feelings. And the best shot that we have at changing our behavior is to change how we think, right? And really to improve the accuracy of those thoughts so that we can facilitate the outcomes that we seek. I think it begins with how we think. It begins with patterns of thought. And for many people, financial independence may not be the goal, or it may not be the goal right now, right? I mean, to begin with, to save money for investment, there has to be a difference between income and expenses, right?
So hold on. Let's back up because you've just interjected this word investments, and hopefully viewers of this video would have watched the last two videos where we started to tease and introduce this concept of FIRE, so they're not unfamiliar with what you're talking about. But yeah, so can you just unpack for maybe the people that have not seen those videos, what we're talking about with FIRE and how the investments component comes into play?
So financial capability, as I mentioned before, is not the same thing as financial independence. Financial capability is the ability and opportunity to pursue happiness however it morphs over time. That's the definition that I write about on Love Feeds Wealth.
Yeah.
Financial independence is a different target. Financial independence is defined as having investments at a level high enough to cover your expenses without having to work for wages. Right? So for me, being a rich social worker would mean being financially independent. I want to have enough money invested in stocks and bonds so that I no longer have to work at a job to pay my bills. That's my goal. That's not every person's goal, right? But financial capability is a priority that I think everyone can get behind because everybody wants to build that ability and opportunity to pursue what matters most to them.
And so what does financial capability look like? If it's not the investments like financial independence is, then what?
You mentioned the Dear Tara letters. So these Dear Tara letters that I write, and they're mostly stories about people that are confronting a problem that sits at that intersection between relationships and finances. And they are struggling usually to figure out how to resolve the problem in a way that attends to their needs in both of these realms. One example is the letter that I wrote about an adult-child relationship, right? Where an elderly mom wants her daughter to continue living with her so
Mm-hmm.
that they can share expenses and so they can also share caring for one another, right? And so in this instance, mom is trying to solve a financial problem through a relationship that she has with her adult daughter. And this happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
Where we're trying to solve one problem with another resource. In another
Mm-hmm.
situation, it might be that this is a story that's kind of in my head right now. A father doesn't approve of his son's choice in marital partner. And
Mm-hmm.
so he's trying to say to him, you know what, if you leave this relationship, I'll pay off your student debt. Right. So, and again, some people would call that a bribe.
Yeah,
In other
like me,
cases,
like
right?
everyone.
In other cases, right?
Yeah.
That's how people get their
Yeah.
priorities fulfilled, right? Is to use
Yeah.
their financial resources in order to influence other people's decisions.
Yeah. So talk to us about your particular journey. And to the extent that you're comfortable sharing your numbers, I know my viewers would really appreciate hearing anything you could disclose.
Sure. As I mentioned, I started on this path, if you will, in 2015. That's when I set my goal that I want to reach financial independence and retire early by my age 45.
Mm-hmm.
So I was 34 at the time. So I gave myself 11 years, 11 is my lucky number, to reach my goal.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that I did was start to track my expenses. I thought I had a really good idea about where my money was going, but I didn't really until
Mm-hmm.
I made it a concerted effort. And
Mm-hmm.
I actually used an app called Personal Capital. It's a free app. I'm a
Yes.
big fan of Personal Capital because it
Yeah.
just makes it very easy
Yeah.
versus trying to do it in a manual paper and pencil kind of way.
Yeah.
So I tracked my expenses and I did it for a few months so that I could capture what things looked like over time as an average, because some months can be much more expensive than other months. And so once I had a handle on what my average monthly expenses were, I multiplied that by 12 to get what my average annual expenses would be.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
this is a crucial number, the average annual expense number, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I use that to calculate what my FIRE number is. And the FIRE number, again, is the level of investments that I would need, right? The amount of money that I would need to invest in stocks and bonds to be financially independent, to feel secure that I would no longer have to rely on a job to pay my bills. So I took my average annual expenses and I first multiplied it by 25. And this was the goal that I wanted to reach by the time I was 45 years old. The number 25, it refers to what's called the 4% rule in financial planning and especially retirement planning. And it's the idea that you can withdraw 4% of your total nest egg, right? The amount of money that you have invested in stocks and bonds, you can withdraw 4% per year over a period of 30 years and not run out of money, right? The likelihood of running out of money is slim enough that you can operate on that guideline. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the 4% rule. It's a good place to start. Now, because I'm hoping to retire early, I need my money to last longer than 30 years because I hope to live a long, productive life. And so I hedge my bets and I'm relying on a 3.25% safe withdrawal rate. What that
Mm-hmm.
essentially means is that instead of saving 25 times my average annual expenses, I've decided to give myself a buffer and I
Mm-hmm.
want to save 31 times my
Mm-hmm.
average annual expenses. But I
Mm-hmm.
will say it was good to start with 25
Mm-hmm.
because that was a big enough number anyway. that
Yeah.
was a big enough goal, right? To keep
Yeah.
me motivated. And so once I knew what my goal was, now it became a bit of a game, right? Like, am I gonna reach my goal? And the next thing that I did was look at my expenses carefully to see what were really needs and what were optional, what were my wants, right? And what was I willing to not spend in order to reach my goal by age 45, right?
Mhm.
And so I took a portion of what I decided was optional and I invested it in my employer sponsored retirement account. So at my job, I had access to a 403B. I
Mhm.
started putting more money into my 403B so
Mhm.
that I could make more traction towards my FIRE number. So eventually, over time, I got some lucky breaks. I got some raises at work. I got some bonuses. I got a couple side gigs, right? Teaching. I plowed all of that into my 403B until
Mhm.
I reached the maximum that the IRS would allow me to contribute to my employer sponsored retirement account.
Mhm.
And so after that, I started looking for other places that I could contribute my savings. Um, and there are lots of other options that people could access, like an individual retirement account. In my case, I started putting that money into a brokerage account,
Mhm.
which is after tax money.
Mhm.
And so on my blog, I don't disclose raw numbers because I
Mhm.
really want to stay focused on the formula, right?
Mhm.
Because everyone's expenses are different.
Yeah.
And what I do instead is I track on a monthly basis how close I am to my FIRE number by
Mhm.
disclosing how many times my average annual expenses we now
Mhm.
have invested. So
Mm.
as of March, we've put away 24 times our average annual
Oh
expenses.
my gosh, that's amazing.
So we're 78% of the way there,
Yeah,
right?
congrats.
Thank you. But
Yeah.
because we've kind of upped the bar, right, to hedge our bets a bit more, we still have to get to 31. So
Yeah.
we are unlikely to reach that goal, right, if our assumptions hold, um, any sooner than 2 years from now.
That sounds like a walk in the park to me in terms of time. But you bring up something interesting because it sounds like you were really disciplined and that you were really focused on, like you said, reaching your goal, which brings up a question. I told my audience that you were about 2 years away from retirement, and so Made to Win said, "How?" I've heard of people doing this with higher income careers like doctors, lawyers, accountants, but how can someone like a social worker, teacher, or even single parent with a low income make that happen? So I don't know if you have any thoughts for Made to Win, but if you do.
I do.